This weekend, the Ofsted inspectors are using the lack of gender identity teaching as a reason for downgrading primary schools. According to a report in The Telegraph, one school was told it requires improvement and mentioned prominently that pupils do not learn about gender identity or gender diversity. Another school was marked as inadequate, which is the lowest grade. Their report referred to a lack of gender reassignment teaching. So to discuss this story, I'm joined by the transgender teacher and journalist Debbie Hayton. Thank you so much for joining me. This is an interesting one because there have been lots of controversies around gender identity and how it ought to be tackled in an educational scenario. Do you think that it is right that schools should be marked down for not promoting this particular worldview?
Well, I think what you said there was promoting a worldview. Schools should be there to teach children facts, they should be able to teach children information and teach children that different people have different opinions. But what seems to come here is that there is one particular ideology, this idea that we all have a gender identity which makes us male or female, and that's what, according to what I read in The Telegraph, children are expected to be taught.
So they're not being told, well, there are people who have a gender identity or feel differently about their nature, and this is a reality of life. They're being taught that this is a thing, that you all have a gender identity. Is that the problem here?
Yeah, because I don't think anybody has a gender identity. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessary to explain that somebody's trans. But this descriptive idea, this almost a lazy description that somebody who struggled with their sex, struggled with their biological sex, had a gender identity, it was descriptive. And it's become a definitive concept which defines us. So you're teaching children about gender identity as something definitive. It can't be proved, it can't be checked, it can't be falsified. I think it's nonsense.
But you say that you don't have a gender identity, and yet people will look at you and say, but this is a trans individual. So surely you must have had some sense of discomfort with who you were.
Yes, but I don't think we need a gender identity to have a discomfort with our sex. Lots of people have a discomfort with their sex, but why do we need to invent this concept called gender identity to explain it? I don't think we do. We just say, you've got a problem with your sex.
Is there any kind of consensus within the trans community on this? Because often we hear of the trans community and that there is a kind of homogenous view therein. But actually, there's a lot of debates going on, aren't there, about this?
There are, but most people within the trans community, to use that term, I really dislike it, actually, but most transgender people, the goal the goal used to be to transition and reintegrate into society and get on with life. It was a solution to a psychological distress. That was all it was.
When it comes to children, I was talking earlier to Kate and Bev from LGB Alliance, and one of their concerns is the ways in which gender non-conforming children, children who don't seem naturally boyish or naturally girlish, are, in a sense, being encouraged to believe that perhaps they are in the wrong body. Do you think that this is a natural corollary of gender identity ideology, or is that perhaps overstating it?
Well, by creating this concept called gender identity, you've created this concept that somebody can be born in the wrong body, a boy in a girl's body, rather than saying you're a girl who likes playing with trucks, you're a boy who likes playing with dolls. We should be letting children be themselves and not saying, here's a different identity which you've got to identify into in order to exist. That's what we shouldn't be doing.
So why is it then we hear from groups like Ofsted, of all people, or indeed the NHS, or these sort of major institutions, who all appear to be in lockstep over this issue? They all seem to be of the view that there is such a thing as gender identity, we all have it, and that to promote or to suggest otherwise is transphobic or hateful. What do you make of that?
Well, it's who's been training them. Those are the questions we need to be asking. Who has been training Ofsted? Who's been training the NHS? Who's been training all these other organisations that have all got the same ideas? It's the people who have been doing the training have been spreading this ideology.
And who is that?
Well, there are a number of trans organisations. Stonewall UK has been training. Groups like Gendered Intelligence, groups like Mermaids, they've been running training courses and selling this, and again, I keep coming back to the word, an ideology that we all have a gender identity.
So in a sense, in order to challenge this, first we have to address the problem of these viewpoints being disseminated by various groups who are often government funded. We see the same in the civil service, we see the same in the various quangos, even in the College of Policing. So it is something that is everywhere. This is going to take an awful lot to untie, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. When I talk to people, I will often say, who told you this and why did you believe them? And the reaction is something that people have taken these ideas on board without thinking critically themselves. A trainer comes in and says everybody's got a gender identity, and they say, well, OK, fair enough. But as adults, we should always be challenging what information we're given, or else we might be being sold nonsense.
I suppose, though, people are trying to be... It's kind of well-intentioned because they don't want to feel like they see and they hear about trans people being discriminated against, facing abuse and that kind of thing, and they don't want to be part of that. So they think this is maybe a way to address that.
Well, people want to be kind. But I would come back to the fact that I don't think gender identity exists. I don't think it's necessary. Is it kind to be encouraging trans people and the rest of society to be believing in an ideology, I think, which is fundamentally false?
OK, now, Debbie, I want to move on to another story, and this is something that happened today, actually, in Bristol. So trans rights activists wearing balaclavas clashed with feminists in Bristol this afternoon. We should be able to play some of the images of this from a few hours ago. And you can see some of the trans rights activists in black masks there. There were apparently a lot of intimidation going on. Protesters ripped up signs. They were shouting, "Trans rights are human rights." And earlier in the day, a group called Bristol Anarchist Federation had sent a tweet calling for people to join them in opposing what they call transphobes. Wales Women's Rights Network said that women had faced absolutely appalling intimidation. They had required a police escort. We've even seen images of activists surrounding a pub, blockading a pub, and a number of feminists sort of trapped inside the pub. And this was a rally that was going on amongst feminists, gender-critical feminists, and then we have this counter-rally from... What's going on here? Is there, there appears to be a lot of conflict between these two groups.
I saw some videos this afternoon, and what I saw were men abusing women. That's what I saw. A group of men abusing a group of women. But... usually, men wouldn't do that. Well, they wouldn't do it so openly. But the very fact that they're screaming trans rights, trans rights, trans rights seems to give them licence to carry out this campaign of abuse.
I'm very confused about this because a lot of the people in those images are shouting things such as, "We're on the right side of history." And also they're swearing and saying things like F TERFs and women. And a lot of it does come across as quite misogynistic.
Yeah.
But they claim to be the good guys.
Well, go home, look after your kids was what one came out on one video. It's the most misogynistic language I've heard for a long time. But because they are supposedly protecting trans rights, campaigning for trans rights, they feel able to do this.
And also the police are present, but often people feel that the police aren't really helping in this situation because they often fly the trans rights flag and all the rest of it. And again, I come back to this point, probably very well-intentioned. But I think that argument about it being well-intentioned sort of starts falling apart when there's people in masks surrounding, blockading, intimidating, often attacking women.
I often hear there's two sides to this. There is only one side hurling out abuse. There's only one side which turns up wearing masks, screaming like this. It's not two ways. The police are in the middle. Yes, their training is to keep groups apart, allow people to engage in peaceful protest. But what was going on from those counter-protesters was not peaceful protest, and looked to me as if some stronger intervention was needed there.
You're right to mention the both sides thing, because I don't see footage of feminists attacking people, feminists shouting abuse. No. I don't see feminists sending death threats to people, but I see extreme trans rights activists sending death threats a lot. So there is a false equivalence here.
Well, there is, yes. There is not two sides to this in the same way. One side is hurling abuse, one side is sending death threats, one side is contacting people's employers to try and get them sacked. It's one way, is this.
Couldn't we have a conversation? I mean, I keep going back to this. Why can't people just sit down as adults and discuss their differences? I respect that everyone has a different view on this. I don't respect threats or abuse or violence.
Well, it's bizarre, isn't it? It's bizarre how this has been allowed to carry on. A group of people who don't want to discuss, don't want to debate, but because they can say we're supporting trans rights, we're protecting trans people, they feel able to proceed with this campaign.
And there's just one more story I'd like to get your thoughts on this evening, Debbie. I'm sorry, we're getting a lot of value out of you tonight. And it's a story you mentioned a little earlier this hour. So swimming's world governing body has announced that trans athletes will no longer be able to compete against women at the top level. Transgender competitors will have to have completed their transition by the age of 12 to be able to compete in women's competitions. There will now be an open category for swimmers whose gender identity is different than their birth sex. So, from my understanding, they're suggesting that because going through puberty as a male confers extra advantages when it comes to athleticism. That's what they're trying to address here. Is that right?
Well, it does. Male puberty gives you huge advantage, but it's not just the puberty which we experience as teenagers, Andrew. Boys have more testosterone at other stages of their development. So to say that as long as a transition is completed by age 12 is not going to address all the unfairness there. But there's something bigger here. What we're saying to 10, 11-year-old boys who are perhaps gender confused, if you want to be a swimmer, then and you're going to transition, you need to transition now. The clock is ticking on you. You can't afford to go through puberty. And that is something that we should not be imposing on children at all.
It does seem very young, the idea of transitioning at 10 or 11.
Well, I think it's appalling. I don't think that children at that age should be even considering it. But what FINA is actually doing is saying to those children is that there is a scope, there is a reason here to transition at that age, and they should not be doing it.
So there's a problem here. I mean, you obviously come from a science background, you're a science teacher, so you understand this a lot better than I do. But I'm also told by some activists, and they will say, but if you take hormones for a couple of years before competing, those advantages are ironed out.
It doesn't. I've just moved house, and my wife and I have been moving furniture, and I always take the heavy end, even now.
OK, even though you have been through
Yes. Yeah.
OK, I think that's pretty conclusive. Anyway, thank you ever so much for joining us today. Debbie Hayton. Thank you.